Before we introduce Shane and we get into the meat of today's conversation, I wanted to, of course, introduce myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Carly Booz. I'm the Executive Director at the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. AHACO, we are a nonprofit group. We are also a membership organization. We have 28 members from kind of across the housing professional space. So we have members who work in homeless shelter system and in the homeless service delivery model. We have members who build and construct and own and operate affordable housing. We have members who are investors in the philanthropic community that guide that. And then at the further end of the spectrum, we have a number of members who work in single family home ownership and making sure that people have opportunities to build wealth and to really lay down roots in our community through home ownership. Our goal is to cut the affordable housing cost burden in half by 2027. It is ambitious as all get up, but after we hit that, which I'm confident we can do together, we're going to keep on going until everybody has a safe, decent place to call home. And we do that primarily through research, through education, through engagement. We love project design, we love facilitation, and inherent in all of that is an element of advocacy and making sure that our elected officials have the tools and the support to make big change in our community. The Alliance has been hosting these power lunches for about 2 years now. It's always kind of been this kind of quiet space for us to bounce around ideas from outside city limits, from looking at what people are doing in cool spaces across the country. But this is the first time we've been able to kind of open that conversation up and to team up with a partner in the community. So we are so thrilled to share this space with Neighbors for More Neighbors Columbus. And as you guys know, Neighbors for More Neighbors Columbus is a grassroots group of residents who believe that we need more homes of all shapes and of all sizes throughout the city. They organize and they advocate for zoning reform. And they support the repopulation of Columbus's urban core. Before we leave today, after Shane talks, I'm going to share all of our contact information. So don't feel the need to write all that down. We'll make sure that you've got it before we get out of here. Very quickly, as everybody is kind of continuing to walk into the room, digitally speaking, I want to provide a little context on where Franklin County is and kind of how we sit in the housing landscape. Before COVID-19, we had 54,000 households that were severely cost burdened. What that means is they were paying more than half of their paycheck to housing costs every single month. That's a threshold that we kind of consider to be the life and death zone, because every month you're making critical decisions. You know, am I going to buy my insulin, or am I going to pay my rent? Am I going to cook my kids a healthy meal and help them with their homework, or am I going to hit McDonald's on the way to my second shift job? That's 54,000 of our neighbors. We also know that just to bake that crisis in, as bad as it is today, without letting it get worse because of population growth, we need to be building at least 14,000 homes every year. And that's one of the smaller estimates that we've seen. Our best year in recent memory is 2020, and even then we only built 11,000. So even when we're knocking it out of the park, we are still slipping further and further behind. That's going to have an impact on all households at all income ranges, but we know it is going to have a disproportionate impact on those who are already most marginalized and most vulnerable. So for example, we've got only 32 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income families who needs it in Franklin County as of today. And in fact, our housing wage, which you'd need to earn just to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment, is just shy of $20 an hour. And for context, only one of Ohio's 10 most common jobs pays anywhere near that. That's the registered nurse. Kind of beginning to see how this becomes a growing challenge over time. From 2017 to 2019, we lost 19,000 homes in the county that rented for less than $900 a month. And again, for context, that's basically the size of Reynoldsburg. It's taking an entire major municipality and wiping it off the map in terms of affordability. One of the long-term outcomes of having a housing crisis to that scale is that we are going to see more people evicted, displaced, and ultimately becoming homeless. Last year, despite kind of unprecedented resources to prevent eviction, we still had 15,000 eviction filings, which is just a little bit shy of our pre-pandemic days when we did not have those resources. One of the things that I like to really underscore when we're talking about evictions and housing instability is that this is not a City of Columbus problem alone, that this is something that affects all of our municipalities. So if you're looking at the map on my screen right now, and I hope everyone can see my slides, these are the zip codes with the highest eviction filings. And certainly we have a lot within the City of Columbus, kind of inside that 270 loop, but high spikes outside of Worthington, outside of Reynoldsburg, outside of Etna, Canal Winchester. This is really a regional challenge that we are trying to solve for. I can't let 100 or so people registered on a webinar go without doing a very small commercial, which is that nobody needs to be evicted right now. We have resources coming out of our earballs to stop eviction. Statistically speaking, 1 in 5 Ohioans are not sure how they're going to pay rent next month. So if you know 5 renters, you likely know somebody who is facing this challenge head on. We have a custom information resource hub just for Franklin County. It is rentful614.com. Check it out. If you've got your phone, pull it up. If you can share it on social media, I will be immensely grateful. If you want to go the extra step and print out a flyer and hang it up at your office or at your library, I will come to your house and I will print it for you. Anything we can do to raise awareness, it's going to keep people inside in a cold winter. Before we get into, before we get into the conversation itself, I just wanted to share a couple kind of principles that we follow at the Alliance. I'm sure everybody here can agree, but these power lunches for us are a space to learn. So we want to come at this with a really open mind. We want to be very engaged in that chat box. Like if you were hearing something and you don't know how it's sitting with you and you want to hear about others, ask a question. Ask it in the chat, share your thoughts, but do so respectfully, right? I mean, let's pretend that we are not online and that we're not hiding behind our screens, that we are in community with each other. We are online though, so we know that if you need to step away, I'm not sure if you hear my dog barking in the background, but if you need to mute and silence yourself, that's fine, but don't close out the window. Your seat will be saved for you. Come on back when you're ready. And then finally, and I think the one that I challenge myself to do mostly is, we all have our spheres of expertise when it comes to housing. We all have our perspectives, but there's gaps in that, right? So we're not here for confirmation bias. We're here to learn. Coming at this with an open mind and really challenging ourselves to think beyond what our personal experience is going to be, I think, wonderful. So with that, I would love to introduce Shane. Shane, I'm sure you guys have already Googled his biography. I probably don't need to read it verbatim, although I will, but he's a national caliber expert. He has a wonderful book. I've got the QR code into it. You should all buy it and read it. Try not to buy it from Amazon, buy it directly from the publisher. And a wonderful podcast that has become like my weird post-workout cool down soundtrack from UCLA, which I think is called Housing Voice, but I might not be remembering that correctly. So Shane is an urban planner and a housing policy expert based in Los Angeles. He currently manages the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative and previously taught as an adjunct instructor at the University of Southern California and worked as policy director for Central City Association, a downtown advocacy org. He is the author of The Affordable City, highly recommend, which addresses housing stability through supply, stability, and subsidies. Shane has written for publications including The Atlantic and the Los Angeles Times, and his blog, Better Institutions, www.betterinstitutions.com. He is originally from Seattle, and he received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Washington and master's degrees in urban planning and public administration from USC. Shane, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is just looking at all the names in the chat. This looks like a really diverse group, people from a lot of different backgrounds, and I really like the practices that you follow, and the flexibility one in particular seems very well suited to what I'm going to be talking about here. Let me figure out how to get I'm going to bump you off the screen sharing here. Move things around. Oh, also, I just because I put my book at the last slide, and there's like a code you can use at Island Press to get a discount, but I just realized I looked and added it to my cart and it just says it's out of stock, so I don't know what to do about that. I'll reach out to the publisher, but again, yeah, if you can avoid Amazon, it's still available at various bookstores, and usually you can check it out from a library too, if that works better for you, just in case anyone runs into that problem. So I'm going to talk today about solutions, really. I think you're all in this group aware of the challenges you face. Those challenges, I'm sure, are somewhat different from the challenges we face in California, but I suspect they are more differences of scale than of kind. In most places, we are dealing with very similar problems, and in many cases, the solutions, especially for places that are growing and have pretty dynamic economies, the solutions are pretty similar too. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to be referencing some notes here on my left if you see me looking over here. But I want to start by talking about a project that I actually opened my book with as well, which is the Yucca Argyle development pictured here. Is just named the Yucca Argyle for its cross streets of Yucca Street and Argyle Boulevard, something like that. It's actually still maybe started construction, even though it was proposed way back in 2014, 2015, around that time. It's 200 units proposed. That includes 40 reserved for low-income households. It's being built on private land, private funding, no subsidies whatsoever. A market rate bedroom in this unit or in this building, like pretty much any new housing in Los Angeles, will probably run a minimum of $2,500 a month, maybe closer to $3,000. But those 40 income restricted units would rent for closer to $800 or perhaps $1,000 a month, depending on their size. That's quite a bit less, actually, than what many of the 50-year-old apartments in Hollywood rent for. Typical prices for an older one-bedroom apartment in the neighborhood might be, at this point, $1,500 or even $2,000 a month. And this is all important because this project would be replacing one of those older apartment buildings, and a pretty big one that also happened to be about 39 or 40 units. So if you're looking at this project from a high level, I think this is clearly a positive trade. You're taking 40 rent stabilized units. City of Los Angeles has rent stabilization, most of which would probably have rents in the range of $1,200, $1,500 a month or more. And you're replacing them one for one with 40 income restricted units that would be affordable for at least 55 years, according to their deed. Plus you're getting another 160 market rate units, which help absorb growing demand. They stabilize prices kind of regionally and in the neighborhood. They densify the neighborhood, which is a positive thing, create new tax revenues. It's just a few blocks in this case from our Red Line subway station. Yes, we do have a subway. And so the whole thing is pretty good for the environment too. And yet the people who live in that 40 unit rent stabilized building put together a large and frankly very effective protest against this project. And I would say it was a very justified protest, and I'll explain why. The problem arises here when we shift our frame from this citywide or region-wide benefit, or looking at the benefits at that level, and we start looking at individual households. So yes, the rent stabilized units would be replaced by more affordable and longer term low income units. Rent stabilized units, as soon as someone moves out, it goes back to market rate. So it's no guarantee of long-term affordability, unlike these deed restricted units. But it wouldn't be the current tenants who actually benefited. Some would earn too little to be eligible actually for these income restricted units, which is a little, kind of perverse problem. Some would earn too much. And even people who were eligible would be competing with hundreds, if not thousands, of other applicants for these 40 units because the demand is just so high for affordable housing in Los Angeles as it is many other places. So the rent stabilized tenants would be evicted, and they might receive as much as $20,000 in relocation payments. And that might sound like a lot, but if you're living on a fixed income, paying $800 a month in rent in a market where a comparable unit goes for double that, $20,000 is not adequate compensation for the loss that you have just suffered. That money is going to run out very quickly. And so, of course, the tenants are going to oppose a project when they're put in this position. And they're not NIMBYs for doing so. This is not an irrational or a greedy thing to do. They're absolutely justified in my view. And many are right to be afraid of having their lives irrevocably harmed by a project like this, even though at the same time, I can acknowledge that at a kind of region-wide level, this might be kind of a net positive. So my main takeaway from this story is that depending on your perspective, you can see this as purely bad or purely good project. And within the confines of your perspective, you might be right. The region-wide benefits absolutely matter, and we need to take those into account. We can't have this death by 1,000 cuts. LA and many other cities absolutely need a lot more housing, but those region-wide benefits, that frame can't be our only perspective. We also need to be concerned with how individual people and households are affected. For those focused, primarily on tenants and individual households, the reverse is also true. Those regional benefits really do matter and they're important. We have to take a look at both. We have to take both seriously and try to maximize, benefits, regional benefits, while minimizing or even eliminating individual harms to the extent that we can. I think we can get so focused on one or another that we can end up scaring away a lot of the people who might otherwise be allies. And a lack of allies, in my view, is why the positive change a lot of us are working for has not yet come to fruition, at least not to the scale needed. So to sort of reframe this in maybe a little simpler, more straightforward terms, I think in housing policy, we often find ourselves in factions. This is probably familiar to many of you. I think the stereotypical pro-housing advocate or YIMBY sees a project like the Yucca Argyle and they ask the question, which is a really important question, who benefits? And that's their emphasis. The stereotypical tenant advocate sees a project like the Yucca Argyle and asks the question of who is harmed. And that's an equally important question. And I do say stereotypical here because I think there are a lot of people who identify as one or the other or both. And they ask both these questions and many more. But this is just kind of to set up this dichotomy. My message in the book and in a lot of my advocacy and my work is that we all need to start asking both of these questions and that better policy will follow kind of naturally as a result of that. So just quickly, this isn't a book talk per se, but it does outline a lot of my thoughts. So in the book, I sort of start by establishing this framework of the 3 S's, and that's supply, stability, and subsidy, as Carly mentioned. These kind of 3 things that we need to prioritize to move forward and make progress. And that's kind of a short part of the book. It's the first 60 pages or so. The rest is sort of making the case for why each of those is really important. But even more than that, the vast majority of the book is specific policies, about a dozen within each of those three goals that we should be thinking about, case studies on how they've been successful, how they failed, policy design recommendations, that kind of thing. So just to introduce the 3 S's really quickly. So again, this is supply, stability, subsidy. Broadly speaking, or I guess you've probably also heard, or many of you may have heard, the 3 Ps of, I think it's production, preservation, and protections. So this is a pretty similar frame. My name is Shane, so I got to go with the 3 S's, but my last name is Phillips, so 3 Ps works too. But for the 3 S's, broadly, what this means is building enough homes for everyone, protecting renters and other vulnerable households, and using adequate funding to fill the gaps left by supply policies and stability policies, because those things cannot help everyone all by themselves. And ultimately, each of these serves a different purpose and has to be a priority for a different reason. And I view this as a policy statement for sure. That is my kind of primary interest, but it's also a political one, and the politics here really matter. I don't think we succeed, again, to get back to this topic of allies, I don't think we build durable and powerful enough coalitions to make positive changes if renters, if young people, if communities of color and households of color, if low-income households and others feel, sometimes justifiably, that change is actually a threat to them, a threat to their housing stability. So to go through each of these three really quickly, why supply matters, I have a few slides here. This first one just shows housing production over the past, 60 years or so, adjusted for our population. And this is just a national graph just to kind of illustrate this trend we've been on for 60 years of down, 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 less and less production. Even the thing a lot of places have been talking about being in a housing boom, at least pre-COVID. And I think it's important to note that the country's worst home building year in terms of total production from 1993 to 2007 was better than its best home building year from 2008 to 2018. So the worst year between 1993 and 2007, we built 1.3 million homes. And the best year, the highest year between 2008 and 2018, we built 1.25 million. We've since, I believe, surpassed the worst year of that earlier period, but we're not far beyond it. So we're just not building a lot of housing generally. And obviously that varies from place to place. A few more charts here. What a really overwhelming and consistently growing amount of evidence shows, including these charts, is that places that build more see their housing prices climb more slowly and they experience less displacement. This is not a universal truth. Context obviously matters, but this is a general trend. The left chart compares the change in rent for coastal California, where very little has been built over the past 40 years, to US counties that have been built, that have built the most housing. And as you can see, the growth in the latter has been much slower. And I'll just say these charts are not mine. These are from California Legislative Analyst's Office report. The chart on the right compares displacement in places that build a lot of housing, and it's specifically looking at census tracts in the Bay Area of California. And it's actually talking not just about housing generally, but actually market rate housing specifically, which I think has some stigma attached to it. So again, it's comparing places that have built a lot to those that have built a little. The dark blue is places that have built not very much housing. The light blue is places that have built a lot. And the two separate groups, all communities versus inclusionary zoning, is sort of making the point that whether you have inclusionary zoning or not doesn't make much difference. The production seems to be much more associated with displacement or not displacement. So all of which is to say, places that build less also have more displacement, generally speaking. Putting aside all of this data, I think we can also just think about this rationally a little bit. As a Californian, I hate to give Texas credit for anything, but if we compare, say, like Los Angeles to San Francisco to Dallas or Houston, all of these cities in both states have really dynamic and growing economies. Lots of people want to live there. Yet LA and SF have much higher housing prices, 2, 3, 4 times higher, and far, far more homelessness. You don't have to like developers. I often find them to be, frankly, sometimes a little tone deaf and not particularly gung-ho about the cause of housing justice, again, generally speaking. But there's just no way that they're the cause of this crisis, as many would like us to believe. You can just ask yourself, are LA and San Francisco more friendly to developers? Is that why prices are so much higher and homelessness is so much worse? Do they spend less on affordable housing? Do they care less about vulnerable people and vulnerable groups? I think the answer is obviously that they are not and they do not. And yet here we are, something else is going on. Dallas and I will say that a big part of what is going on is that Dallas and Houston build 2 or 3 times more housing per capita than LA or San Francisco. And I can tell you, it's not because people want to live in Texas so much more than they want to live in California. Not to say that one is especially more desirable than the other, but California is at least as desirable to a very large number of people. And the reason we're not growing and Texas is, and the reason our prices are growing and Texas's are not compared to ours, is largely because they built a lot of housing. I'll just add one more note that Tokyo, which is its metro area is almost exactly the size of California population-wise, builds 5 times more housing per capita than us. And it happens to be one of the most affordable mega cities in the world. So putting this in text a little bit, why supply matters. Supply for me is about acknowledging the physical and economic constraints of the housing market. We can't have affordable and accessible housing if we don't have enough homes for everyone. That's just a necessary starting point. And if more people want to move to a place and they have the money to do so, no amount of wishing otherwise will keep them out. We've tried that for a very long time. It has not worked. And frankly, it shouldn't be our goal anyway. We should consider ourselves lucky to be places where people want to live and work. The other point, which is the corollary of this, is that scarcity empowers landlords at the expense of tenants, and it empowers property owners and sellers at the expense of buyers. It's just an economic reality. For each of the three S's, supply, stability, and subsidy, I like to always acknowledge there are things that each can do and things that they cannot, which is why all of them are important. What supply can do, it can stabilize prices. It can create new resources like taxes and affordable housing. It can help us build the city we want and change in positive ways. And also, of course, it's just a fundamental need. We have to have homes to live in. There's no avoiding that. But on the drawback to supply, or the shortcoming of it, is that it is slow to manifest. It doesn't always go exactly where we need it because we're generally relying on the private market to provide most of it. And it's not going to turn a very expensive city. If your city has a median home price of $500,000, you're not going to supply your way to homes that cost $300,000 across the board. It might help prices from going up even further. It very likely will. But I'll come back to this later. It's a really good reason for why a place like Columbus is in a good position, taking these issues seriously now rather than when prices have got much higher. So I'll just slide by this quickly, but if you want more information on the role of supply, there's a few good things, and one of them is mine, which I'm a little embarrassed to have it on here. But the first one is sort of the big picture, like why supply matters, and it's a very accessible article written on the subject by some folks at NYU. And the second one is on this question specifically of what happens at the neighborhood level. Like when I build new housing, a new apartment building, what happens to the existing apartments on the block? What happens to their rents? And the answer we found generally is that the rents actually are held down by that construction. But these links are here. I'll share the article, the slides here if that's useful at the end with Matthew and Carly. So quickly, some supply policy examples. These are just to generate conversation. There's a bunch more in the book, and we can talk about anything anyone wants, but just maybe this generates some conversation for later. Things like building up your commercial corridors and centers where transit is most effective and residential displacement is least likely. I am very ambivalent about this one, actually, because I think some places try to just dump all of their housing onto transit corridors, and I think there are problems with that. But as part of the solution, I think it's absolutely worthwhile. Zoning for higher density across wide swaths of the city, and I can come back to this later as well, but not just saying everything's going to go downtown. It's all going to be high rises or mid rises, and that's what we're going to do. For a lot of reasons, that is not, it's better than doing nothing for sure. But when you concentrate all of your sort of capacity for new housing in a small area, you're guaranteeing that the land prices are going to rise to eat up a lot of the potential savings you could have there. And when you can zone much more broadly for housing, even if it's just sort of the missing middle, duplexes, fourplexes, that kind of thing, if you can zone where that's available in a much larger share of your city, 20, 30, 50% of your city allows these kinds of things, make a much bigger difference, and you don't see your land values go up as much. Making more developments by right. So increasing the certainty that when a developer comes forward with a proposal that meets the standards the community has outlined, they can just proceed. They don't have to negotiate anymore. They don't have to wonder if they're going to have additional costs imposed on them, if it's going to take them 2 years longer, because who knows what's going to happen. This really just comes down to doing quality planning up front and having the conviction to stick to the plans that you've made rather than having these plans that are often made as they are now. My colleague Mike Manville calls this pretextual zoning, where the plans are almost made. The zoning is established with the intent of bargaining it away, which is not a great, it encourages corruption. It just makes people doubt the process generally because they know it's not going to stick around. And then, a fan favorite, always got to mention it, reducing or eliminating parking minimums. I'll have to get confirmation. I was looking this up, and I actually read Walker Consultants says that Columbus had the first minimum parking ordinance in the country, which is, I'm sorry, or I guess maybe you should be sorry, but maybe you can be one of the early ones to reform it as well. I always do these charts anytime I'm talking to a different city. If it's in the US and we have this metro area map, this is from Build Zoom. They made these animated GIFs for the entire country, metros across the country. And what it basically shows is the development patterns over the past, I can't see the top here, but it starts in 1940 or 1960. But the light blue is census tracts where most housing that was built during that period was single family. The orange and red are sort of multifamily, and then dark blue is the is when places where basically almost nothing was built during that period. And Columbus actually looks better here than most places, but you can still see just the growth of those dark blue areas where nothing is happening. And I want to point out, at the same time, you are seeing the places with red and orange kind of concentrate. And, there are fewer orange places. There are actually more red. We're forcing all of our development into these 50+ unit structures because it's not allowed almost anywhere else. And that's part of our problem here. So moving on to stability, I came to housing policy with an emphasis on supply. For a long time, I thought, that's all we need to do. Like, ultimately, if we build enough housing, things are going to be okay. And I still do believe that it is the most essential thing. It is the thing we have messed up the worst in many respects. And if we don't solve that, not a lot else is going to matter. But the longer I work in this field, and the more I just talk about housing and hear people's stories and give presentations like this, the stronger I feel about the role of stability. I think we all need to ask ourselves, what do cities have to offer the large number of households who rent? From my perspective, it's rising rents, often restricted only by what the market will bear, the possibility of eviction at any time for any reason, no prospects for wealth creation or forced savings through wealth creation through forced savings, and a diminishing chance of escape into home ownership. And it really has been, I think, traditionally sort of an escape. So I think we have to ask ourselves, do renters have the same moral worth as homeowners? Or are they effectively second-class citizens who really only gain their full rights through the acquisition of real estate? And the way I'm asking these questions, I think it's clear what I think the answer should be. But unfortunately, I think the answer right now is basically that renters are second-class citizens, and that's how we treat them. So I think a lot of us, to go back to this really quickly, especially those of us who are privileged enough to expect to eventually own our homes, I think we take it for granted that for many people, renting is not just a phase in their lives. The hassle of dealing with a landlord who might not respect you or treat you with dignity, who might try to take advantage of you in any number of ways, who in most places can legally raise your rent by any amount or evict you pretty much at any time. A lot of us implicitly accept that, just that's the way it is, but eventually we can move beyond it. We shouldn't, is basically my message here, for the very basic reason that we are all human beings, we are a rich country, and absolutely nothing that I've learned about housing policy indicates to me that treating renters like shit is a precondition for housing affordability. It just isn't. And I think if there's like one message that I want people to take away, It's that. We do not have to make this trade-off, and we have been forced into it in large part because we do things like we say 90% of our city is single family only. And so all the change that happens where low-income renters live. These kinds of policies are choices, and they're not choices we have to continue to make. So if supply is about responding to physical and economic realities, stability for me is about meeting our moral obligations. A person shouldn't have to, and I'll add here, something I've been thinking about a lot more lately is that affordability is really important, but so is just security and peace of mind and knowing where you're going to live a year from now and knowing that your rent is not going to be 50% higher. Again, I think those of us who have a little more stability in our lives really take that for granted, how important that can be. So in terms of what stability policies can do, they can shield people from rising rents and eviction. They can keep things from getting worse for individuals and for kind of cities writ large. What they can't do is really solve the underlying drivers of housing prices, which most of the time, and for the most part, really come down to supply and demand. And they also can't do much usually to help people who don't already have a home. These are not problems with stability policies. They are just acknowledging the fact that they serve a different purpose. Again, some stability-oriented policies here. Rent stabilization, this is, again, something I was much more skeptical of in the past, but have come to support in most contexts. There are limitations on this, and I think you can't just go all out on rent control, but this is where the policy design really matters, and we could talk about that. Limiting low yield developments where you're replacing 5 apartments with 10 or 6 or 3, actually losing units, like that's not good development. Requiring negotiated buyouts or right of return, some kind of displacement protections for people. These things are all possible. And they're actually easier when the supply policies are in the right place. Finally, why subsidy matters. Subsidies are ultimately a tool that we can apply where supply and stability policies fall short. And I think we have to ask not only how do we spend our tax revenues to generate better outcomes, but also how do we raise revenues in ways that might encourage or induce better outcomes. So like a property or a land tax might actually help not only raise revenue, but also discourage speculation because the ability to just sit on empty or vacant land is limited. So again, what can subsidies do? Subsidies can help and do help millions of people for whom supply and stability type of actions are just not enough on their own. But they cannot help everyone. They just can't. When we fail to provide enough supply and keep people stably housed, the number of people who need assistance grows, and the cost of helping each person increases as well. And so if we don't address those problems, I mean, just look at Los Angeles, where a unit of quote unquote affordable housing costs $500,000 to build. And that's up from $300,000 only, maybe a decade ago. Because we failed on these other areas, we're throwing more money at the problem than we ever have, and we're not making any progress because the costs just keep going up. So a point I want to make here, and this is a little more forceful than maybe it needs to be, but how I think of this is not a menu of options. It is not supply or stability or subsidy. It is all three. And if you choose to prioritize just one or two of these things, you will fail. You will not be where you want to. You may keep housing relatively affordable, if you build a lot of housing, or you may protect some residents from immediate harm if you enact certain stability policies, but you will leave so many people behind, and you will not become a more just and equitable city or region or state relative to where you are today. And you'll just frankly make your job harder. Like I said, costs will continue to rise. You'll be facing people who are displaced who didn't need to be and having to spend money helping them, those kinds of things. I sort of think of this as like a three-legged stool. The idea being that if you pull any one of these legs out, the whole thing falls down. Supply without stability can mean unnecessary displacement and disruption, kind of concentrated harm. Without subsidy, it means poor households will just be left behind because, building housing, it's new by its very nature, and new things are expensive. Doesn't make them bad, but it's not going to, a new home is not going to be affordable to someone earning $20,000 a year. It just can't without subsidies. Stability without supply, and especially without subsidy, is really just managed decline. It's not progress. And then subsidy without supply will lead to rising costs, and subsidy without stability will just lead to many people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise. So just to rephrase these, another way that I think about these things, focusing only on supply is a recipe for basically concentrated harms and diffuse benefits, which is kind of the story of American manufacturing, if that's like an analogy that works for you. We all have cheaper TVs, but 500 people who worked in a warehouse earn a third of what they used to. And that's sort of the story with housing, where if you're just doing supply and you're displacing some people, maybe it's keeping housing affordable kind of writ large, but you're doing real harm to a small number of people, and you don't have to. It doesn't have to be that way. For the other two, focusing on stability or subsidies alone is ultimately just engaging in this scarcity mindset. And the reality is you just can't redistribute or preserve your way out of a shortage. A shortage has to be met with more supply. So a point I want to make is, it's not every individual's responsibility to prioritize and work on every policy area. There's just too much to do. But I do think it is, or it should be, everyone's responsibility, at least among, folks like us who really care about this stuff and spend a lot of time working on or thinking about it. We should at least understand how our priorities intersect with those of others. Are the policies we support complementary to these other priorities, or are they in tension? Because the reality is that sometimes policies can do more harm than good, even with the best intentions, if they're not paying attention to how they interact with other things. So just rent control as an example, as I said, I am a supporter of rent stabilization. Rent control, rent stabilization, how you define those, there's lots of different elements to this policy. One of the most surefire ways to have rent control do what the critics say, which is like really sharply reduce the production of new housing, is to apply it to new housing, to not exempt new housing, basically. And I think it was St. Paul just approved a policy that will do this. And so we're going to see the results. But it's one of these things where it's so easy to exempt buildings for their first 15 years and allow them to sort of age into a rent stabilization program. The people who live in new housing, they're not really in need of a lot of support. There's not much cost to exempting new buildings for that reason. And yet some people want to go like just maximum all out, do everything they possibly can in this policy and not be concerned with how it might affect supply and how that might affect kind of the broader region. And those kinds of awarenesses are what I'm talking about here. So making the case for housing, and I'm going to wrap this up here in just a moment. Some things that I think are important and have thought about quite a bit. I think it's really important to invest in representative surveys of a community, not just rely on these public meetings where like 6 people show up and they're disproportionately white, disproportionately homeowners, disproportionately older, retired. They're not representative. And when we do actual representative surveys of people's attitudes towards housing, they usually support more housing and they support change in their neighborhoods. And so we need to find ways to kind of bring that out of people, because we're not going to bring people who are just okay with housing in their neighborhood out to a public meeting. It's just never going to happen. And it's a bad way to assess kind of public attitudes or public sentiment. I think we need to make the case that growth means opportunity and investment. Cities can't stop growth ultimately, or at least the pressures of growth, but they can shape it to provide the things that residents want, whether that's more and diverse housing choices, jobs, public services, shops, restaurants, open space, and so on. I think we have to make the alternative clear. I've kind of hinted at this. The alternative is not just things stay as they are. The alternative is prices keep going up, homelessness keeps getting worse, more and longer car commutes for people, higher greenhouse gas emissions, all of these negative things. That is the trend we're on. There is no freezing time and just keeping things as they are right now. And the last one is just, I think it's important to not dwell on if we should do things, if we should take various actions. And this applies, not just to housing, it's true of transportation. I see that a lot there too, but to focus instead on how. Just don't even engage, if you could avoid it, in the question of if we should do something. Ask how we're going to achieve the things that we know we need to. A couple more slides here. Some age-old wisdom that I think is especially apt for Columbus. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I looked up Columbus's prices. Price-wise, you are still in 20-year-ago territory. So plant some good policy, plant some trees, start now. It's going to be much easier to enact solutions that clearly benefit a wide array of residents now, when housing, when kind of the gap between a new market rate, privately built, unsubsidized home is not so different from the cost of a subsidized one. Here in LA, we're a new home might be $800,000, and yet we somehow have to get the price down to $200,000 or less for a very large share of our people. And it's such an impossible task. So don't let yourself get to where we're at. Some more recent wisdom that I always like, I just love this quote a lot. This is from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, 1965. Zoning is a means by which a government body can plan for the future. It may not be used to deny the future, to avoid the increased responsibilities and economic burdens which time and natural growth invariably bring. I know you're all working on your zoning update right now, so hopefully this is the spirit that is being taken into that process. So with that, thank you so much for allowing me to present here. I know I've taken up, not left a lot of time for questions, and I apologize for that. Feel free to contact me at any of these addresses. You can listen to our podcast, UCLA Housing Voice, where each episode's about an hour long, and we dive into a specific subject with a housing researcher, try to make it accessible to people who are not housing researchers. And on the right there, as I said, there's a promo code for my book, but maybe you can't actually buy it from Island Press. So we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Shane, that was wonderful. I've got like a whole notebook of notes and ideas coming out of that. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Do you want me to remove or stop sharing here?
Sure. If you want to take it down, I would like to get as many questions as we can jam.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, there's one or two questions in the chat already, but go ahead and add yours. I'm going to try to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first one, which is, I think if anyone has seen me talk in the last 8 months, you know what I'm about to say, but cities, counties, states across the country have this kind of once in a lifetime opportunity with state and local recovery funds, these hyper flexible, unrestricted dollars that can be used to build back stronger from the pandemic. And at the Alliance, what we've kind of challenged ourselves is, if we take 30% of those funds, which is what we tell families to spend on housing, and we put those to government housing or to public housing or to housing policies or to housing investment, housing growth, what would that do to change our trajectory, right? So if you're talking about planting trees and you personally have kind of one-time but catalytic and investment opportunity, how do you begin to bite that elephant?
Well, I will say that I think, if you can spend a lot of that on housing, that's great. I think the challenge with housing is it's just so expensive. And oftentimes you have to put a lot of equity in, even if, you know, it's ultimately going to be paid off by rents or sale prices or whatever. I think, so for that reason, I think it's really important that some of that money just be used for planning. And that's not a very expensive task in the grand scheme of things compared to how much money is out there. So I think, as I said, doing that real community planning, getting engagement in the planning process, as opposed to individual projects, doing it early and getting that buy-in for like a bigger actual vision for the community, for the city, for the region, not just for what this specific building is going to look like and its cornices and where the trees are going to go. I think the former questions are much more important. And so I think prioritizing that would be a really high priority, and you know, kind of setting yourself up for the future. I think, you know, if you're trying to spend it on money or on buildings and construction, that kind of thing, I think, you know, actually, it might make sense in some ways to try it with existing housing. Something I've written a lot about, and I plan to write more about, is using public funds, using even private funds for acquiring existing housing and basically turning it into social housing, kind of figuring out that model with housing that already exists that might be a little more affordable, recognizing that it's not going to be enough. It's not increasing the supply, but it's a way to start testing out these different approaches. The one other thing I'll say, especially because Columbus area is relatively affordable, you can build new housing and sell it, and that it's like pretty reasonably priced, it seems like, and a lot of people can afford it. And so if you want to kind of have a good turnaround on your money, focusing on for sale housing, including, you know, I'm thinking like multifamily condo kind or townhomes, that kind of stuff. You can take all that money, spend it on these ownership opportunity housing projects, and then they're sold, and then you got the money all over again. And you can start over. And maybe you sell them for zero profit. It's just at cost, that kind of thing. That's like one social housing model, sort of the Singapore model almost. Maybe not that that reference doesn't work everywhere as like a selling point, but it's like taking the best from different places, I think, is one approach there.
Very cool. Thank you. I'm going to let Matt ask the next question.
Great, thanks. So you mentioned the kind of inequity in the planning process that favors homeowners. And to that end, the recent survey that went out last year about our zoning code update for the city of Columbus had 77% of the respondents as homeowners, and only 45% of Columbus is owner occupied. So there's clearly that inequity. So you mentioned representative surveys. Are there any other specific suggestions or recommendations you have to increase renter engagement? I know it's really difficult, and I know people want renter engagement. It's just difficult to get it. So any specific ideas you've seen that have been successful elsewhere would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe, I'm not exactly sure the best place that would be the corollary here, but I'm a big fan of, like, with transit surveys, actually going to the bus and the train and like surveying people where they're at. So, I mean, I think door to door is probably asking a little too much, but I think it's important to note that I don't know exactly what Columbus's situation here is, how much time, staff time, is spent on like public meetings and that kind of thing. But like, you, instead of doing these public meetings where, you know, you might have 3 staff people talking about one project or one, even just one building, like hosting a meeting about it, those people could be just out in the community engaging with people more directly. And they might even though it might seem like, well, it's nice to bring everyone to one place, often so few people show up that even if you're just knocking door to door for several hours, you probably get in touch with more people. So I think that's one element of this. There was one other part, I'll probably have to come back to it. I think it's, I've lost the other thing I wanted to mention, but it had to do with the planning process again. It's just so important, but we can take another question.
Thank you. So this one is coming from Brent Warren, and I believe that this is probably the same Brent Warren, who is a wonderful housing reporter at the Columbus Underground, but I'm not making assumptions. And he asks that you said there are problems with just dumping all of your housing on transit corridors. Can you expand on that? here, the Link Us initiative is heavily focused on bringing higher density to improve transit corridors.
Yeah, so there's actually a really good article about this. I think it's in Sightline. It's about Vancouver specifically. So if you just search like Vancouver Sightline transit corridors or arterials, something like that, you'll find it. But the idea is basically arterial corridors where transit tends to be located. There are, positive things about these locations, but they're also often the most polluted places in a city, outside of like right adjacent to a freeway, and often not particularly pleasant to walk on or bike on and that kind of thing. And so you end up sort of, I've heard it phrased this way by people who want housing on these locations and not elsewhere. They want like a buffer between them and in their like lower density single family neighborhood that's 4 blocks away from the arterial and the arterial itself, to like protect them from the pollution and everything. And it's just, there's something wrong with that when like that's our sole strategy. And historically that has been our strategy, particularly with communities of color, to just sort of put everything, either put a freeway through it, or once the freeway is there, put everything next to the freeway where it's not going to bother people with more resources and more political power. So that's one big part of it. The other is just like, think about communities that you really love, like that you would like to walk around in. They're not just linear. They're not just like, I can only walk down this street and only this street, and everything else is just kind of like nothing, just super low density, no shops or anything. Like communities are omnidirectional. They're not just north, south, east, west. And so I think filling in areas, around a transit stop, and if you're trying to support transit ridership, if you only have housing on the corridor, the people who live 1 or 2 blocks north or south, you could have much higher density there too, and really have a lot more riders and a lot more, people supporting the businesses and so forth. So it's just kind of a missed opportunity.
So unfortunately, I think because of time, this is going to have to be our last question. It comes from Mindy Justice. And she says, we know that concentrating low-income households together does not serve a community well. At the same time, there's often pushback on how mixed income development benefits neighbors. Is there any message that you think will bring skeptical folks along?
Well, like a first point I'll make is that sometimes bringing the skeptical folks along is not the most important strategy. A lot of times, the people we end up engaging with are the people who have already made up their minds. And a lot of times we just have to recognize that they are one person or a few people, and they are not representative. And we have to bring our case to people who maybe have not already made up their minds. That point aside, in some respects, I feel like, I don't know, it just depends on who you're talking to, because some people are like viscerally anti-income restricted housing. Others, on the kind of usually opposite end of the political spectrum, they're viscerally anti-market rate housing. And then the mixed income is like trying to appease both in some way, but not really appeasing anyone. I don't know. I think there's no like perfect answer to this. I was just talking to someone about sort of income restricted housing specifically recently though. And this is maybe an easier case to make in Los Angeles, where we have so much homelessness, and it's very visible homelessness, lots of encampments and that kind of thing. And so making this point that like, it's clear that not building the homes is not, quote unquote, keeping these people out of your neighborhood. And I think making the point that like, if you're concerned about crime and that kind of thing, that crime is very often, there's so much literature on this, crime is not, people are not like criminals, quote unquote. People commit crimes, and they often commit crimes because of the circumstances that they're in. And so the more we can do things to put people in circumstances where crime does not feel like their only choice, we know that that actually helps reduce crime and violence and these kinds of things. And so I don't think that's the perfect answer. There is no perfect answer, but it's figuring out sort of what the person is getting at, like what's their real concern here, and doing your best.
That's a great kind of note to end on. Maybe I'm like the eternal optimist, but I think that the momentum is here in Columbus. I think our elected officials, everyone from Mayor Ginther to Councilman Favor, who chairs our housing, to our county boards of commissioners, they get it. They all see that the path we're on is leading us to look more like the homeless crisis in Los Angeles. That's our 20-year, but we are at that sweet spot to turn the tide back.
Yeah.
And together we're going to get it done. So thank you so much for coming in, kind of sharing your insights. We appreciate you. I think more than I can express. For everyone else, I want to make sure that I did kind of share the contact information for both our organization at the Alliance. We are just haco.org. Our Twitter is kind of the nerdy data policy guru side. We share things from Shane and other academic experts constantly. Facebook is a little bit more mom and dad friendly, more on programs, opportunities, and videos. For Neighbors for More Neighbors, their website is morecolumbusneighbors.org, and their Twitter and Facebook are both very engaging as well. And I'll make sure to send these slides out afterwards to everybody who registered. And at that, I just want to say thank you. Successful power lunch. I hope you guys have great days.
Thank you. Thanks, Shane. Bye, everybody.